Let's have a look at the Audi Q3, which is Audi's baby SUV. It can basically summarize in the phrase meh. Its comfort is adequate, its amenities adequate, everything about it is unremarkable. Its engine is unremarkable, the interior is unremarkable. The only redeeming feature really is that you can actually fit into the boot, which is kind of a plus. We can start by looking at the styling for the car. Now the Audi Q3 does actually look quite nice. It looks relatively similar to the other Audis in the lineup, and it actually continues the trend of cars having increasingly large grilles, and perhaps unnecessarily large grilles. But still, it does look quite aggressive on the road. It does look quite nice, especially when you compare it to many of the other SUVs, which look incredibly generic. This one actually looks a bit better than the average. We can also sort of look at some other features in the front here. So for example, the hood has these nice little striations on it, which create a bit of interest. It's a bit better than a plain boring hood, but nevertheless it does look quite nice at the front overall. Continuing around to the back, the Q3 also looks quite nice at the back, not quite as aggressive as the front, but quite pleasant. Let's now take a bit of a look at the interior. The interior itself isn't that interesting, but it is pleasant enough. There's nothing terribly much to report. The storage space is actually pretty adequate. There's seat pockets and the glove box has a normal amount of storage. So it's a pretty normal front of an SUV. Now in terms of the comfort and the seats themselves, they're not bad. So they're leather seats obviously. The seats themselves are actually pretty comfortable. Now the seats can be adjusted. They're adjustable quite reasonably, so there's quite a few options. They're easy to adjust using the electronic controls. This is pretty standard for a car of this type, so it's probably what you would expect from an SUV from a company like Audi. Now there's enough leg room, it's pretty easy to fit in. Now if we look at the interior and the rest of it, there's quite a lot of plastic. So the interior front console has a lot of plastic. So the climate controls are all plastic, but they're easy to use. If you go up to the multimedia settings, they're again plasticky, but they're easy to use. The plus side is there's a lot of physical knobs here, so it's easy to adjust whatever you want. Now if we move up to say the infotainment screen, the infotainment screen is quite small, so it's a little bit disappointing from a car in this class and from this manufacturer. It probably needs more size there. Now the rest of the console again is relatively unobtrusive and pleasant enough, but unremarkable. It's probably not to the standard you would expect from Audi, however. So if we move over to the gauge cluster, the gauge cluster is largely analog, but obviously it's reasonably pleasant. There's a little bit of an infographic in the front that tells you whether the doors and the boot are open. It's relatively standard. Again, nothing terribly exciting to report about it, other than it being a normal SUV. Now we can sort of continue around to the rest of the car here, so let's migrate around to the back of the car and see what's going on here. Now it initially appears like there's not very much legroom. Now this is probably because it looks like it's quite condensed in the back here. Now in reality it's not terrible legroom wise. I'm not the tallest person in the world, but I have enough legroom here. There's some storage pockets as well, which are pleasant enough. The netting itself isn't that useful, especially given the indenting in the back of the seats, but it again gives you some storage. Now a disappointment is there isn't any USB function in the back, so there's no way to charge any smartphones. That's a little bit of a disappointment from a 2018 car from Audi, but nevertheless it is what it is. Now the back itself is otherwise relatively comfortable. The seats themselves are actually quite supportive. There's nothing terribly much to say about it. Now if we move around to the boot itself has quite a decent amount of storage space. Now you'll see different storage figures reported. It's really going to depend on which outlet you're looking at and whether they're looking at it in terms of the seats being collapsed or not. Nevertheless, it has probably about 16.7 cubic feet of storage. That's going to vary a little bit depending on exactly which iteration and configuration you take in terms of the seats. Nevertheless, it's easy to open up and it's easy enough to close, so it's a relatively functional SUV in that respect. An obvious question is if you can fit in the boot. Well, the answer is you can. It's not comfortable, but it's pretty spacious in there. You can close the boot itself, but you're not going to be able to get out. Well, there's nothing terribly much to say about it. The acceleration is adequate. Basically, we can move along, it accelerates okay. The maneuverability is alright, it handles corners adequately for an SUV. Now the plus side about it though is that in Sydney the roads are pretty terrible. The Q3 handles the roads quite well, and in particular in the area I'm driving at the moment, it's a debacle due to construction work, so basically it's handling all of the potholes, all of the terrible streets, everything it's taking in its stride, so it's actually pretty good in that respect. So it handles traffic alright as well. It has good visibility. I can see pretty adequately out the back. I can see to the sides quite well. There are cyclists all around. I can see them quite well as well. It accelerates slowly. It brakes okay. There's nothing hugely interesting to say about it. It's okay for suburban driving. Now obviously one of the major selling points is its practicality in terms of the storage space. That's always great if you want to transport things like bicycles or just storage or luggage or whatever. So that's a plus. Another plus, of course, is that if you're in a city like Sydney or a city like New Orleans, where the roads are terrible, then obviously the Q3 is great for that, and it's handling the roads around Surrey Hills and Sydney quite well. I lived in New Orleans for a while. It would probably handle those roads quite well as well. Given that they're pothole filled, you'll need something like an SUV to really deal with them. So just driving around during the onset of peak hour here, it's actually not too bad driving it. It's reasonably pleasant. I can drive it around. Nothing terribly exciting is happening. Now, the acceleration, I'm in an open stretch of road at the moment. The acceleration is laborious. It really isn't in a hurry to go anywhere, but it at least is passable. Alright, so the Q3 is adequate. It's unremarkable in terms of its interior, unremarkable in terms of acceleration, unremarkable overall. It's not expensive, so in that respect it's possibly worth considering, but there's nothing terribly interesting to say about it. It's going to be a passable way to get around the city if you need transport, and that's pretty much it. So thanks for listening. I hope it's been an interesting and useful video to you, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.